Julian Marsh had just settled into his desk when the first tremor arrived. It came not as a headline or a phone call, but as a discreet message pinged to his encrypted inbox. Check the launch date. Urgent. He clicked it open, expecting a scheduling oversight, maybe a misplaced RSVP or a clashing engagement in the royal calendar. Instead, he found himself staring at a soft pink digital invitation. As Ever Rosé, a new chapter begins. August 31st, Malibu. For a brief moment, Julian didn't react. Then it hit him. August 31st wasn't just another date. He reached across his desk for the royal observance calendar, a hardbound, meticulously maintained logbook. As he flipped through the pages, the number stared back at him, circled not. In red but in respect, Princess Diana Memorial Day. He dropped back into his chair. The air felt heavier. It wasn't just that Meghan had chosen that date. It was the combination of it, a glamorous wine launch, pastel tones, sun-soaked laughter, all unfolding on the anniversary of a woman whose memory still cast a quiet shadow over the royal institution. He had seen what the public did with timing. Context, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Julian didn't waste time. He called Oliver Redgrave, who answered on the second ring. Julian didn't dress up the message. He simply laid out the facts. Meghan's brand was launching a sparkling rose line, and the event was locked in for the same day Diana had died. There was no ambiguity. No room for misreading. Oliver didn't respond right away. He simply went. Quiet. In that pause, Julian already knew the weight of what had been unleashed. Within the hour, the palace's communications floor was alive. Screens displayed the event teaser, hashtags were pulled from early previews, and a short internal report began circulating with the headline, Potential Symbolic Conflict, Duchess of Sussex Brand Launch. Julian sat in the center of it all, reviewing digital mock-ups of the product. The tagline read, Elegance Never Apologizes. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowed. It wasn't just careless. It felt like a challenge, somewhere. Far from the royal press room, cameras were already being prepared. Rose bottles were being chilled. Meghan, no doubt, was being styled. But in London, inside the walls of an institution that still mourned in silence, the first flicker of public outrage had already begun to form. And Julian, who had always believed in coincidence until now, suddenly didn't believe in it at all. Oliver Redgrave stood motionless at the far end of the briefing room, his hand resting on the windowsill as he stared out at the gray morning. He had listened to Julian's report without interruption, eyes fixed on nothing, jaw set. Now, just hours later, the consequences had already begun to ripple through the palace corridors. By the time he stepped into the press strategy meeting, the temperature in the room had dropped. Perceptibly. He entered without ceremony, coat still on, and dropped a printed screenshot of the Rose launch announcement onto the polished table. A few aides leaned forward. Most already knew. But seeing the date in bold serif font beneath a pink wine bottle made something land. It wasn't just poorly timed. It was seismic. James Holcroft, seated at the head of the table, scanned the page and exhaled through his nose. He tapped his pen once on the table, then looked to Oliver. Oliver didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply outlined the reality. Diana's memorial had long been treated as a private, sacred day. There were no royal events scheduled, no press engagements, no social media posts. It was a day reserved for grief, dignified and unspoken. And now, whether through ignorance or intent, Meghan had placed a celebration of branding, sparkle, and self-promotion directly on top of it. James rubbed at the bridge of his nose and instructed one of the junior staffers to quietly contact the family's liaison in Kensington. They needed to know how the Prince of Wales was reacting. So far, no comment had been made, but silence could only last so long when the press began circling with headlines already half written. Outside the palace, the backlash was beginning to flare. A royal historian had tweeted an oblique message referencing the cost of forgetting dates that others carry in their bones. Tabloids pounced. Online debates ignited. Every photo of Diana's past now floated beside the rosy branding of As Ever, painting a cruel contrast that no PR team could easily dissolve. Edward Vane, watching from the sidelines in quiet exile, read the headlines with a tightening jaw. He remembered sitting with Meghan years ago, coaching her through brand narratives and calendar sensitivities. He remembered her asking about the palace's soft lines, the things they never said but always honored. And he remembered warning her that dates, more than statements, held memory in royal culture. Now, she had either forgotten that lesson or discarded it. Meanwhile, Oliver drafted a confidential strategy titled Operation Soft Counter. It was not a rebuke, not a correction, just a quiet recentering. He proposed a spontaneous, unscripted visit by Prince William and his children to Diana's memorial garden. No announcement, no photographers invited, but just enough presence that it would be noticed. Let the public contrast joy and reverence on their own. As the meeting ended, James remained seated, staring down at the invitation page still lying on the table. He didn't say a word. He simply turned it over, as if burying it. 3 days had passed since the launch, and yet the storm had not moved on. In fact, it had deepened. What began as whispers across social media had evolved into morning headlines, late-night panels, and editorial columns across Europe and beyond. The phrase symbolic insensitivity had been repeated so often that it now sounded like fact, no longer opinion. And inside Clarence House, the atmosphere had grown brittle, not panicked, but alert in the way old walls brace for unexpected tremors. Julian Marsh moved through the corridors with less certainty now, the confidence in his stride softened by doubt. Though he had been the first to catch the date clash, he still couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed. Had he flagged it sooner, louder, could this have been avoided? He buried himself in monitoring trends, building a heat map of backlash by region and age demographic. He presented it to Oliver in a short briefing, but Oliver merely nodded and closed the file without a word. There were no metrics left to analyze. The damage had settled in people's minds. Meanwhile, Prince William had carried out the quiet visit to his mother's memorial garden as planned. He arrived with his children early in the morning, long before tourists filled the walkways. No press were notified, no official photographers brought along. But one passerby, unaware of palace discretion, had snapped a distant photo, the prince standing with his back turned, one hand resting gently on his son's shoulder as they looked down at a patch of lilac. The image had been shared, then reshared, until it found its way to the front page of a national tabloid by evening. It needed no caption. Inside the palace press office, James Holcroft stared at that image in silence. He didn't react to the photo, nor the flood of sympathetic headlines that followed. Instead, he reached for an envelope in his drawer, an unopened letter dated 5 years earlier, addressed in Diana's hand. He had kept it for reasons even he couldn't fully explain. That morning, he placed it in a folder marked Historical Assets and slid it into the Royal Archive cabinet. Symbols, he now understood more than ever, were louder than words. Edward Vane watched the whole thing unfold from his apartment overlooking the Thames. He received calls from international news outlets asking if he would comment on the Rose launch and its implications. He declined each one, not because he had no thoughts, but because he knew anything he said would become ammunition for one side or another. And he was done being a pawn in wars waged in metaphor. Instead, he wrote a private email to a contact in the French press. It contained only a single paragraph, a reflection on how memory isn't always erased by loudness, but by misplacement. He clicked send and closed the laptop. The sound of the click echoed in the quiet of his flat. Across the Atlantic, Meghan posted a new photo from the Rose launch, her smiling beneath vineyard vines, a glass raised mid-laugh. The caption was a quote about freedom and fruitfulness. No reference to the controversy. No indication of awareness. For many, the silence spoke louder than any denial ever could. By the time the second week arrived, the noise had mellowed into something colder, not a backlash, but a quiet turning away, the kind that doesn't shout but simply refuses to look. And inside Clarence's house, Oliver Redgrave felt it more than most. He moved through the halls with practiced calm, but his thoughts lingered on the same realization over and over again. Not all missteps cause uproar, some cause erosion. He stood before a fireplace one morning, reviewing a list of upcoming engagements. The Queen Consort would be appearing at a hospice in Bristol. Prince William had another unannounced visit to a charity school. Every event had been selected with care. Soft optics, clear purpose, no extravagance. The tone was being adjusted deliberately, not because they needed to defend themselves, but because they needed to remind the public who they still were. Oliver placed a red check beside each event and paused when he reached a tentative proposal from a fashion house requesting royal endorsement for a sustainable fabric line. He shook his head and crossed it out. Right now, nothing glossy would serve them. Meanwhile, Julian Marsh had begun pulling older royal clips from the archives. Diana's speeches, her hospital visits, her unpublicized hours spent holding hands with dying patients. He arranged a small package of these for the palace's Internal Legacy Week, an event meant only for staff. He didn't know why it felt necessary. Maybe because the memory had been used, unintentionally or otherwise, as a backdrop for something fizzy and pink. He wanted, even quietly, to bring it back to what it had always been, sacred. Far from London, in a hillside vineyard under California light, Meghan held a follow-up tasting session with guests. The laughter was light, the tone airy. No formal statement had been issued, and none seemed forthcoming. The brand had sold out of the first run. Commercially, the launch was a success. But a kind of coldness had crept in beneath the celebration. A knowing discomfort even among supporters who didn't say it aloud. Something about the silence had lasted too long. Something about the date would not be forgotten. Edward Vane sat in his modest study as the rain tapped gently against the windows. He scribbled in the margin of a notepad, crossed out a sentence, then wrote again. He had been offered a book deal last month, a memoir of his time navigating royal media storms. He hadn't answered yet. The words didn't come the way they used to. Not after this. Not after seeing remembrance become a stage for wine glasses. He closed the notebook and looked at the newspaper on his desk. It bore a front-page photo of the Princess of Wales lighting a candle beside a garden statue of Diana. No headlines. Just a date in the corner. August 31st. He folded the paper and tucked it away. Some legacies, he thought, don't need defending. They just need space. Space to breathe. Space to remain unbranded. And as the sun fell behind the city, Oliver turned out the lights in the briefing room one by one. The glow from the courtyard spilled into the dark. No statements would be made. No response would be issued. The institution would not lower itself to the noise, but it would remember, and it would endure.